Thank you all so much for coming. I'm just going to do a little introduction, but most of this talk I really want you to hear from the University of Lincoln, which is where Sam, our student perspective, and Ian, our library and teaching and learning perspective, come from. So I'm Matt, Managing Director of Technology from Sage. This is Ian, Head of the Library and Teaching and Learning at the University of Lincoln. Sam, a classical studies student at Lincoln, who I saw in your Twitter bio earlier, likes shiny Roman things. And then, unfortunately, couldn't be with us today, but will be joining on video, Jamie Wood, Professor of History and Education. So I hope you'll find this quite a unique perspective in a conference like this, because we're going to be talking about not just traditional library perspectives, but also student and faculty perspectives. So why does Lean Library, a part of Technology from Sage, why do we care about this so much? Well, we have been focused a lot on what the future might look like for the library over the next 10 years. And we've done a lot of research on the ways in which patron and librarian relationships are changing, the way patron behaviors are changing as well. And we see a lot of change for the library over the next decade. And I think what's been interesting in conversations on the fringes of this conference is just how many changes you are all going through as well, in terms of recruitment challenges, talent retention, increased need for technical capabilities within the library. There's just so much going on. So I've got two quotes here from this report that we did last year, Librarian Futures. The first is an interview we did with a librarian from the University of British Columbia, which I think sums up the kind of status quo challenge quite nicely. That libraries are not yet being seen by their universities as service providers for patrons. There is still this old-fashioned view of collections and books on shelves. And we know that's not the reality, but that is sometimes the challenge that libraries face when they're competing for budgets within the university, that faculty and the administrative staff don't necessarily see just how far the library goes beyond the collection. So that's something that we want to address in this talk today. Really to pick up what Lorcan Dempsey, another person we interviewed in that report, talks about, which is this idea of workflow being the new content for librarians. I think Roger Schoenfeld also talks about this idea that libraries might shift focus beyond the collection towards service provision for patrons, those patrons being both faculty and students. So today what you're going to hear about is you're going to hear about a research project that we worked with the University of Lincoln on in the UK, where we sought to really understand how undergraduates work, what challenges they have engaging with library resources as recommended to them by their faculty, and what tools and improvements we can make in that workflow to make a better learning experience for the student, and the role that the library can play in mediating that. And if you're interested in finding out more after this talk, we have a podcast series on choice. You can see the link there, but also if you just Google choice and undergraduate workflow, this will come up as well. And we go in more detail then on our research and our findings. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to talk about her research.
Apologies in advance, my voice is slowly dying, so if you can't hear me, just let me know and I'll try and project a bit more. So the key aim of the project was to investigate student perspectives on reading lists or resource lists, with a specific focus on discovering what is deemed a good or bad experience with them. This involved asking targeted questions about good or bad qualities of reading lists, and what elements students would prefer to see incorporated into future practice to improve their experiences overall. The research itself involved gathering data through an international survey and several focus groups. The students involved as participants came from all levels of study and across a broad variety of disciplines, so there's a really significant variety in student experiences that our data captured. So in the research, a number of important aspects emerged. The first key one of these was the importance of signposting in research resource lists. So time and time again, students mentioned how the best reading lists they experienced had clear indications as to which resources were essential, recommended, or further reading. Conversely, the worst reading lists they had experienced lacked these features, and it was unclear which resources were a priority for them to engage with. Students in both the survey and focus groups reinforced these notions. Signposting was a strong theme across all areas of the research and came up consistently in the feedback. Expanding on this, a number of students also highlighted that the specific signposting of the passages they should engage with would be extremely beneficial. This saves time, but it also means that they don't get lost in the pages, if you will, when engaging with the text. In the student view, strong signposting can make or break a reading list, and in the case of longer lists with lots of resources included on them, it was deemed essential by a number of the focus group participants to have strong signposting. Signposting was said to make the long list more approachable, as it was easier to navigate. Particularly in the case of longer lists, a lack of signposting was often found to be overwhelming for students, meaning that they simply did not know where to begin with the resources they were given. They didn't know how to engage with them or what avenues to take. Finally, regarding the actual structure of reading lists, two preferential systems from a student perspective were either a thematic or weekly organisation, so either grouping resources based on shared themes and topics, or by when in a module or course they're actually studied. Okay, so closely linked with signposting is the factor of organisation. The main takeaways here were the importance of clarity and consistency in the organisation of the lists. One specific aspect which was the subject of great discussion in the focus groups was the desire for greater guidance built within the reading list and resource list organisation. Simply signposting a material as essential, recommended, or further reading was great. However, a preference for greater guidance on how to actually utilise the resources and why they're important to their study was preferred by students. It was proposed that such an approach would enhance engagement with the resources, as by highlighting the importance of them to the student, they understood why they were actually given them to engage with in the first place. There was also a preference for the clear sectioning of resources in the organisation of the lists. The ease of navigation of a reading list was an aspect frequently mentioned as a feature of a good reading list, and this was often stated as coming from clear, strong organisation of different sections of the list. So essentially the list wasn't an extremely long text of just block suggestions of what to engage with. Additionally, a consideration of assessment-related materials in the organisation of a reading list was also an aspect students preferred. Unsurprisingly, the research revealed that reading lists are most frequently utilised by students when they're working on assignments, as they refer to the suggested resources when they are researching and completing their projects. So, reading lists that highlighted which materials were most useful in these assessments were thus viewed very favourably by students. Length and usage were also interesting topics explored by the data. So students are frequently engaging with their reading lists, overturning any notions that students simply don't read or engage with their resources that are held by some academics, unfortunately. They are frequently engaging with the lists, as shown by the 56.9% interacting on a weekly basis and the 18.5% who engage multiple times a month. Another area frequently raised by students was how long a reading list should be, which is a very hot question. A clear preference amongst the students for more concise reading lists was suggested. However, this does not mean reading lists should simply be kept to essential reading only. Students are very engaged with the recommended and further reading on the lists they are provided with over 70% engaging with the recommended resources and further reading, so going above and beyond the essential requirements of their course. As a result, it is clear that there still needs to be an element of wider reading in these lists, but perhaps not to the excess that some current reading lists exhibit. So the specific content of the reading lists and the relevance of resources was another major theme that emerged in the research. An interesting aspect here is the student preference for a variety of resources, both in terms of the type of resource, but also the opinions and ideas expressed in them. So one student very aptly summed this up with the latter preference when they assessed their worst reading list experience, and that the negative experience was due to readings containing purely Eurocentric understandings of a concept and little diversity of approach, idea, or experience. Furthermore, the preference for the variety of resource types was broadly expressed, with specific resource formats praised, including podcasts, videos, and ebooks. Students quite liked variety on that front. It meant they were constantly engaged with what they were provided with. Resource availability was also a key concern of students. Online resources were praised significantly due to their apparent ease of access and wide availability. Many of the responses pertaining what constitutes a bad reading list or had a bad experience with a resource list was students describing how they could not easily access the resources, whether that be to broken hyperlinks or down to it being a physical resource. Physical resources were not widely praised in the responses from students, as many students complained that they simply did not have enough resources for their cohort, and then it ended up being almost akin to a fight to get the resources from the library. Yeah. So overall, it is clearly demonstrated by the research that students have strong views of what makes a reading list good and what is a good experience for them. So to summarise, a strong signposting of resources, clear organisation, reasonable lengths of lists, and a diversity of resources are all elements of a positive reading list experience, and therefore should ideally be incorporated into future practice.
Brilliant, thank you, Sam. My part in all of this really, as a librarian, is just to give some of the context, really, of how we use education for Talis products and how the research that Sam has talked about fits into what we do on a day-to-day basis. We've got here we are, it's a little bit of a summary of what Lincoln's about. I'm not going to read all of that. I think you could summarise it as we're a fairly young institution, but with a bit of a history. We're fairly small, particularly in the context of the US, with our 16,000 students. And we're structured reasonably kind of sort of traditionally, but with a strong focus on being part of the education that the university provides. And I think that's what gives us a particular part to play in this process. So I should also say that, as I think you're probably aware, there's quite a challenging and changing landscape for education in in the UK at the moment. We've gone through quite a lot of change, a lot of it driven by government legislation and regulation, the move to marketisation, which I know is not really a surprise for you, but it certainly is for us. And within that, the thing that we all suffer from or experience, that increasing competition for students, the need to diversify income in institutions, and globalisation, where students are essentially an international commodity that institutions almost try and trade off against each other. In the UK context, there's been a lot of focus on quality assessment. As it happened, I spoke at this conference 4 years ago, and at that time we were talking about the new teaching excellence framework. Well, we're now talking about the not-so-new second iteration of the teaching excellence framework in the UK, and all institutions are beavering away to provide a submission to the government that explains why their teaching is really good. And of course, every institution wants really good teaching. But within that, there is a good recognition that the student experience and student outcomes are really important to us. And obviously they are the most important things to our students. Alongside those issues of value for money, well-being and employability. But alongside that, in the UK in particular, there's been quite a strong media narrative questioning the value of higher education, so putting us under a lot of pressure. And again, as I'm sure you're aware of, there's a very strong struggle at the moment over the cost of living crisis in the UK, fueled by fuel prices, the war in Ukraine, and all of those things making a very challenging environment where we actually need to do quite a lot. Now, I said that the library in Lincoln has a very strong educational focus, and I think that is really quite important to what we do, and a strategic alignment with the mission of the university as a part of that. And again, as we've sort of heard, that idea that the library is part of the the sort of value proposition of the university, and that what we do is not just about measuring who comes through our doors, but actually what kind of difference we make to those students and how we reach them and help them achieve their kind of abilities and their potential. Within that, obviously student retention and progression is very key. I said that we have quite a lot of quality assessment as well as the teaching excellence framework. There's also a research excellence framework, just to make sure that that's not forgotten. And alongside that, there's an increasing focus on educational analytics, and that means we do rely on the systems we use to deliver some of that context. And all of that means we have quite a multifaceted role. We need to be experts, we need to be a service provider, as was referenced in that opening quote, but we also need to be a partner in the education. And to do that, of course, we have to be agile and responsive. And it says there at the bottom, under pressure to do more and better for less. I guess that's the day job in line this, isn't it, at the moment? So our response to that has been over a period of time since 2010 to really make the Thales ecosystem, and I suppose I should properly say the SAGE, Education from SAGE ecosystem, part of what we do at Lincoln in the library. We started with Thales Aspire for reading and resource lists, as Sam has indicated, but we've actually moved on a long way in those 12 years, taking on Thales Aspire digitized content, which allows us to really deliver digitized extracts from books to deal with some of those problems of access to the physical resources and to integrate that into the reading list system. Lean Library, as Matt has talked about, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And alongside that, more recent innovations, Sage Catalyst, which is a series of books from Sage that are fully integrated into the Thales products, and Thales Elevate, which is much more integrated into education. And what I want to do is just talk a little bit about how we've used those products and how we use them with our academics, but also show you how we've addressed some of the points that Sam has raised. But I want to really emphasise how important that student voice is to us. I think we know that in all contexts, reading lists and what libraries do and what academics do is a bit of contested territory, and sometimes territory that can't actually see each other and have got no idea what's happening in the other domain. And I think as librarians, we've always struggled with that because we see students day in, day out, they come into our spaces, they talk to our staff, they engage with us, and we know that giving them a reading list that doesn't actually give them any information about the item they're meant to read or context of why they should read it is not really going to work. So I think the research is really important for me because it actually supports what we know in many cases, but really gives us the evidence to argue our case there. And it also really opens up that dialogue because though I talk about kind of opposing sides there for a moment, we should really be partners with our teachers. We should be working with them to give them the resources that they want to use with their students. All of our use of Thales has been driven by a reading and resource list policy, and to some extent those things are really a sort of dangerous territory because nobody really likes following policies, do they? There's always that idea that policies are just there to make life difficult. But actually, the point of our policy is to guide academics so that they produce lists that are workable and usable. And the research shows us that what's in the policy actually does support that. And all of that does lead us to working for a better student experience, which comes back to all those quality metrics that we were talking about earlier. So in terms of what things look like, and I do apologise, this is much less faint on the screen, is all I can say. But we're suffering a little bit in the lighting here. But again, you'll be able to see these afterwards. And this is actually one of Jamie Wood's reading lists, and you'll hear from him in a moment. And it just shows you that idea that things are divided out. It starts, if you're really good, you've got good eyesight, it starts out with week 1 at the top, and then towards the bottom it says week 2. So you have to trust me a bit on that. But just that idea of students knowing exactly what they have to focus on. And this is hopefully a fair bit clearer, but not as clear as I would like. Just showing a different approach. This is much more thematic. And again, you probably can't quite see, but it does say right at the top here, just to pick up that point that Sam mentioned, the first book, this is a history of medicine reading list. This is about Chinese medicine. It says, please read, slightly plaintively, pages 76 to 318. But after that, it says, especially pages 76 to 124. So recognising that those students, oh, that's almost all of the book, I'm not going to do that. Well, if you can't do that, just do that bit. Please just do that bit. And it starts that dialogue with the tutor almost kind of leaning over the student at midnight when they're in the library, 2 hours before their assignment's due, or whatever it is, saying, well, read that bit, and that will give you what you need. And that, I think, is one of the great elements of how we've been able to use TALIS. One, it's extremely flexible. You've almost seen two different views of reading lists, suited to what an academic or a teacher is wanting to do, and it allows that extra messaging, and that is really powerful, I think. This is just a little bit to show you how we use Lean Library, and this is really about recognising that much as we like to think we have an ecosystem with all the resources that we buy, all the money we spend on behalf of students, that we curate nicely and place in our lovely organised libraries, most students don't work like that. They're out there in the Wild West, on the web, Googling everything they can find, and the real power of Lean Library is it lets you take those library resources out into that Wild West. And it means that if they're searching Google Scholar, you can put your links in there and they can get through and also authenticate easily to your resources. And you can just about see again, this is a search on the history of medicine, and you can see on the right-hand side there, that's the library's chat box that is made available. So immediately, students, if they have a problem, they can talk to staff and find out why they can't get through to resources or get some extra guidance. And then I talked about TALIS Elevate being a product that, in a sense, takes us closer to the teaching. And again, we're taking his name in vain a lot. This is one of Jamie's pieces of work. And this is really just showing how TALIS Elevate allows you to create something around a resource, generally speaking a published resource, but it can be a video, it can be a link out to the web, and encourage student collaboration around that. What I think is probably not as clear as it could be, on the right-hand side, all of those coloured dots are students, and they're all commenting on those resources. And what our academics have found is that that is an extremely powerful tool in allowing students to engage with resources and to bounce off each other. And again, the power of how TALIS have set this up, you can let students be completely anonymous, so there's no pressure. But it's obviously all recorded in the system if you have any issues. Important, that one. But you can also make it in a very easy and a very low kind of barrier way for students to get engaged. And certainly what some of our academics say, and Jamie will definitely support, is that that allows a greater degree of engagement than they've seen in other sort of forums. And it's actually one of the areas where that collaboration does happen online. So we know there are some products out there that do that, but it is very hard to get students to really engage with things like Blackboard Collaborate, if you're familiar with it, those sort of things. But this, because it's very focused around a task, does actually work really well. And I talked about the importance of the data and the analytics. This is again just a slide shot, just showing that kind of that engagement with Elevate. You can see when students have used it, you can see how long they've used it for, how long they've stayed in the resource. And again, that gives us very powerful data for an academic to say, okay, those students are fine, they're engaging, but hang on, there's this group who aren't. And to have a chance to have that dialogue, well, why didn't you do that? And it allows them to focus their efforts, but actually see where there's a problem. And at that point, I think we will run the Jamie video.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sam and Ian. So Jamie's going to talk to us now. He sadly couldn't be with us today, so his is a recording. It's 5 minutes. I'm just going to...
And we also make extensive use of the Aspire reading lists, which I know you're hearing. Hi, my name's Jamie Wood. I'm Professor of History and Education in the School of Humanities and Heritage at the University of Lincoln, and I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in Charleston today. I would have loved to have come, but we're in the middle of semester here, so I'm teaching. I'm going to give you an extremely quick overview of some of the ways in which we work together in the School of History and Heritage at the University of Lincoln with our university library, and hopefully that will help to contextualise some of the things that other people in the presentation a session are talking about. Okay, so going to be quite quick, 2 to 3 minutes I've been told. So one of the ways is by integrating our subject librarian and the library more generally into our administration and our provision. So the librarian sits on teaching and learning committee and a number of other committees within the school, which means she's aware of the sort of like decision-making processes and kind of input into kind of policy around teaching and learning, and make us aware of what's going on in the library. The subject librarian also is responsible for delivering a number of skills sessions on our degree, right from the first semester that the students arrive. She's integrated into delivery of particularly kind of core skills around information literacy and things like that. We're lucky that our subject librarian is also a historian, so she actually delivers modules in the school as well. So she's responsible for direct teaching of our students, which enables her to kind of get a better knowledge of where they are and where they're coming from, and also is able therefore to integrate, I think, much more deeply some of the skills development activity around information literacy. The library's also been vitally important in developing our provision of resources for students, but not just books and access to databases and e-journals and things like that, but also providing platforms for us to deliver content and develop student skills. I've got particular expertise of using experiences and expertise in using a tool called Talis Elevate, which enables students to kind of annotate readings and work together to kind of understand readings that have been set. It's got great kind of analytics built into it, which is also really helpful in developing students' kind of skills and being able to track how they're doing. And we also make extensive use of the Aspire reading lists, which I know you're hearing a lot more about today, which is a very good way of kind of structuring student engagement with readings and resources through the course of the module. Finally, I think it's really important to note that we work closely with particularly the subject librarian, but the library more generally, in evaluating and researching the impact of what we're doing. There are a number of initiatives, but I'll point to one that I've been closely involved with, Active Online Reading, which is about investigating students' experiences of reading in online spaces, and particularly focusing on how we teach them, or in some cases don't teach them, to read in those spaces. And we've worked collaboratively with the library to develop this research, and particularly published with the subject librarian, who's Hope Williard, who's mentioned on the reference you can see there. One of the key resources we produced as part of the Active Online Reading project was a series of infographics, which are directed mainly to students and were developed in collaboration with the Quality Assurance Agency in the UK and Talis. You can see one of them there on how to focus on reading in a digital world. But on the final slide, what you can see are the other ones that we developed, which are really focused. Most of them are focused on students. One of them is focused on a kind of institutional perspective. And if you follow that QR code, you'll be able to download all of those as a package. I hope that was a bit over 3 minutes, but I hope that was okay. And I'm really sorry I can't be in Charleston. I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Firstly, big thank you to Sam and Ian and Jamie for all of their research and their work. I hope you found it really interesting. It's been very transformational for us at Technology from Sage. And I know you would have seen a lot of different technologies there, but I hope what you can see is that at Technology from Sage, what we're focused on is this area of emerging technologies for the library that are all about trying to ensure the library's relevance within the faculty and student user group, and ways in which the library can support changes in online learning, changes in the way that students engage with resources in the Wild West, as Ian referred to, and that's really the connection between all those disparate products, between Talis Aspire, the reading list solution that Ian showed, Talis Elevate, the social annotation and collaboration tool, and Lean Library, our browser extension for libraries. So with that being said, I have a couple of questions myself I'd love to put to Sam here, but more importantly, I'd love to hear if you have questions to put to them. We've only got one mic, so I'll move it around a bit, but please fire away. Hey Josh, if you give me a question, I'll repeat it for the...
I can speak pretty loud too. I mean, my question is maybe pretty naive, but a reading list in my mind is at the bottom of the syllabus. Is this something different in the UK? Do universities have a standard reading list, or what is this?
I think that would probably be a very good question, but Ian, you
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just trying to work out how we do the right things. It's really interesting. I guess what we do at Lincoln is common probably across the whole sector, because we probably copied it from someone else being a relatively new institution. Every module that makes up a programme, we have very modularised education in the UK, would have its own module handbook. And that's probably what you're talking about. And what academics would do is they would type into that Word document their readings. But of course, then they were fixed. They were fixed when they typed them in. They couldn't put any links to help students find them. And somebody probably said, oh, you can't put all that there in, just put the top ones. So what we've done, and I've talked about our policy explicitly says, don't type your links into the module handbook, type a link, create a Tallis reading list, and then put the link in. And that, I think, just changes the dynamic from it being a fixed, static thing to being an active, engaged thing that can be updated, but also can actually take students to the resource. I probably shouldn't say this, but when we first introduced Tallis in 2010, we had quite a few academics say, well, isn't this spoon feeding? You're making it easy for the students to find things. Well, actually, in these times of students as consumer, of value for money, of marketisation, we're meant to make things easy for the students. And an active reading list that's online and clickable does that, whereas a printed Word document doesn't.
Yeah, so maybe it's just an obvious point, or it's not that important, but do you think we should change the name from reading list to something that covers the variety of resources?
We tend to talk about reading and resource lists a little bit interchangeably, but actually we do read for a degree. That is still the kind of mode, but I guess I think these things are actually perhaps the window dressing. The important thing is the right resources are on the list and the student knows how to find it and how to use it.
And I'll just add to that, one thing we're working on with Tallis Elevate, the annotation tool, is making sure it can engage with multiple types of content. So video, podcasts, articles, ebooks, you name it. I'm sure there'll be lots of not considered there, because it is really important, isn't it?
Now with Tallis, how do you get the text in there? Or how does that work?
So the text is brought in by faculty, but we also have direct integrations. So for example, we have direct integrations with Sage content. So it's all done natively, you don't need to do anything in addition to that. What we're going to be working on in the future is ways that we can get Tallis Elevate embedded in our Lean Library browser extension so that it can follow undergraduates on the web and they can annotate on things without us needing to integrate directly with those. Sam, did you want to add something on that?
Oh, I was just going to say I've used Tallis and Inspire. Of course, a variety of resources. So last semester I used it when annotating like a YouTube video. It's quite surprisingly well. I thought there'd be a jump between going from, let's say, PDFs of text to, watching a video, and it works the same sort of premise, and it gets classroom discussion going. It's great.
You mentioned earlier that there's a lot of pressure on students to be able to afford education, and also the parents of students, maybe £9,000 a year, whatever it is now, depending on the region. And I was wondering at Lincoln, if it's a Russell Group institution, and the dynamics with being the educational aspect and also the research that goes forward, if there's, and also if there's pressures being, to be able to sustain the institution. The more international students you bring in, maybe they pay double what the local students will pay. If there's a bigger gap with international undergraduates, then
Yeah.
I kind of threw out a lot there.
I was going to say, there's a lot to get to grips with. It's kind of, I don't know, we're in a different country, I can say this. We're not a Russell Group institution, and we're proud of it, because our focus is predominantly on our undergraduate students. But that doesn't mean that research isn't important to us, but in some of our Russell Group institutions in the UK, students are just there to kind of provide a source of income, and the research is what the institution prioritises and is proud about. We're proud about our students and what they achieve, and Sam's a great example of that. But we do research, because all of education is founded, and academic work is founded on research, but we actually do it with our students, not against them. But that point you make about the tensions in the institution around costs is really significant. And there's a kind of double whammy there. Students are probably finding the amount of the fees that they have to pay, because they pay it back in tax after they graduate, they don't have to pay it while they're studying, a burden on them. But the government has frozen that fee regardless of what it's costing universities to actually teach. And in this cost of living crisis, everyone's affected. The cost of fuel, cost of salaries are rising. And there's actually a gap between the income coming in from students and what we have to pay to keep the institution running. So that is where international students come onto the market, because they are a kind of cash commodity, because we can charge what we like, obviously in competition with every other institution around the world, so it's not a free market. And that does create some pressures around the quality of education, the support you can give them, and also that slight danger, dare I say, that they are more important for the pound signs than what they'll get out of the experience. So that is a big challenge, and of course, in a country that's slightly turned its back on the EU, our focus is kind of on different bits of the globe at the moment.
Building on the research aspect, Lincoln actually, of note, recently got the School of History and Heritage within the University of Lincoln was awarded the top research output in the whole of the country, so including against like Russell Groups and such. So just once again showing that the Russell Group status is not necessarily equate to quality of output.
I'll just ask you a quick question. My name is Lola. I'm from the University of Toronto, and we use a reading list solution at U of T called Legato, and I was wondering what was your selection process like, and how did you come to settle on this solution?
Yeah, that is a really good one. I think it's interesting how the market has developed. When we tendered for Palace back in 2010, there was one other solution on the market. It wasn't Leganto at the time, and it wasn't as fully featured as Talus, and it never has been. And it actually kind of withered away and died. But of course, other companies are out there, and Leganto has sort of come onto the market. And it is interesting because competition, we're kind of all in a competitive environment, so having other products. But we've found, as we've gone through our process, we've at least been through two more tender exercises, because the government makes us do that every few years in the UK, and we have still found that the level of integration and the reach of Talus is very important to us, and I think that's really quite interesting. I see Talus as a solutions company. They find problems in the kind of library context and actually solve them, which is not something that all tech companies do by any means. And for us, what we've seen is the way the product has developed. We started with reading lists, but the way that digitized content has been added, and just to sort of try and sum that up, TADC allows us to effectively embed the kind of legal aspects of copyright clearance into the process, into the workflow, and not worry about them. Pre-Talus digitized content, we had to do a manual audit every year for the Copyright Licensing Agency to prove that we only copied the things that we were allowed to for the people who were allowed to copy them. That has been automated as part of the workflow, and it's been a huge sort of relief to staff. We probably have long forgotten how many staff hours it took to do that work. And what's been really interesting is that Talus has then moved on. They haven't just said, okay, we've done that bit, let's stop, let's put our feet up, let's just sell that product as hard as we can. They've moved into other areas. And the tie-in with Sage and the way that there's possibilities of deep integration of content like Sage Catalyst is really good for us, because as Sam said, that one of the great things about Elevate is it allows you to create a standard experience across a range of materials and formats from almost any supplier. And that actually is a really powerful thing in terms of the student experience, because we hit our students with enough different platforms, enough things that they have to log into and authenticate. The less we make them do that, the more likely that they will actually get to our resources rather than stopping at that first failed link or that second MFA login or whatever it is. So it's that environment that I think is important to us.
Can I just ask a follow-up? Do you pay, when you purchase transactional licenses, do you pay a flat rate per number of students in the class, or do you pay per student who has opened the PDF or visited the link?
That's a good question. Is that a trade commercial secret how you do your pricing, Matt? That's slightly above my pay grade.
No, not at all. Is that question about content though, subscription?
Yes.
So I guess in that case that...
No, sorry, I didn't realise it. I thought you were talking about the cost of talent. In terms of content, we have something in the UK called JISC, which was a set of initials, but it no longer means anything, so it's just a word that's made up. And their job was really to kind of provide technology for universities, and they diversified into a division that looks after content. And the best deals we have, we pay by band according to the turnover of the institution. So if you're a small institution relatively like us, is it like 200 million turnover in UK pounds? We're kind of about in the middle of the bands, which is really good, and all those Russell Group institutions are at the top, paying twice as much as we are. That's kind of Robin Hood principle.
Yes, please.
You go first.
I was just going to ask, in the library at Lincoln, have you seen kind of increase in usage of those resources as a result of TALIS or the reorganisation principles for those reading ones? So are students increasingly reading that section that you really, really should read of that book? Are they watching those videos, watching those podcasts?
You're probably at a granular level that we are not quite at. What we can say is, obviously, COVID turned things upside down in terms of use of resources and use of spaces. So our e-resource use has gone through the roof. Physical use of resources is recovered, but not to the level it was pre-COVID. And then within that, there is a huge amount of information to unpack. And as it happens, big relief, I've finally been able to appoint a project data librarian who's going to start work in January of next year, really trying to unpick and delve into those resources. Because as a working librarian, I have a ton of data, but I don't have a ton of people to analyse it. And that is a real kind of disconnect for us. So actually having somebody whose only job is to understand their data for us is going to be extremely powerful, and he's going to be extremely busy.
Maybe they already have the answer to my question, because you had this tracking curve on one slide. Would you consider this tracking curve a kind of typical curve for the books you're offering there, or is that quite a good tracking curve, usage curve?
I think it's fair to say that's probably what it is. And I think again, it's that kind of the hidden bit of this is there's a huge amount of data, and I suspect Jamie knows more about those students than the library staff do, because obviously that's his bread and butter. His job is to teach those students and to get them good degrees at the end. Well, not get them good degrees, the students have to do that. He needs to set them up to do that. And therefore, a key thing that he needs to be able to do is track how his students are progressing. And the good thing that the system allows you to do if you have the time and the inclination is you get an assignment in, get a student with not as good marks as you'd hope, you can track back and say, well, did they engage with the resources? And you can have that dialogue, because we all know if you sort of get up at 2 hours to midnight and just write the first thing in your head, you might get a pass, but you're not going to get a good score on anything doing that. If you go and do the reading, if you build your argument up, if you build your resources in, test you on how you were getting on with what you were working on last night, you're going to do better. But actually having a process where a teacher can have that dialogue with a student and say, well, yeah, you've got a pass mark, but you're really just you've got a surface view of the resources. You haven't engaged with them, and I can see you didn't do the preparatory work, and that's why it's so important. So that sort of detail really lies with the teacher, because that's their part in the process. But we can help to make sure we package it up and make it as easy to use as we can, and that's obviously where Talis and Sage come in.
Ian, a good follow-on to that is the question that we've talked about before, but I would love to have here as well, is about why should it be the library that's engaging all these things? Why should the library be responsible for helping faculty improve the usage of resources and these questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it was a nice point that Jamie made about this collaboration. As I said earlier, to some extent, reading lists have been a kind of contested territory between academics and libraries, and this point about the fixed word processor list is a good example of that. I think libraries spend a lot of time and effort providing resources. Academics spend a lot of time and effort trying to impart knowledge in their students. Only if we bring those two things together will we actually get that perfect circle and that transition to work. And I think that is something that libraries and academics should collaborate on, because, as I said at the outset, we moved away from the input-output measures. Yes, we can spend X million on resources, and I'm sure the Elsevier's of this world would like us to spend more X millions on their resources. But actually, what we really want to do is spend our hard-earned money that comes from the students in a way, because they'll pay it back in their taxes eventually, on the resources that make a difference to what they need to learn. And that's where we all need to be collaborating.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the floor? How are we doing for time?
I think we're 5 minutes over, technically.
In that case, let me thank you all very much for joining us, and a big thank you again to Sam and to Ian and to Jamie and all the hard work you put into research.
Oh, yeah.
Please do help us up as well to all of our goodies at the back. Thank you very much for coming.